Welcome back, tyrants and newcomers alike, to 999. Last episode, we finished a laboratory door, and a bunch of other stuff happened that I can't remember because it's been a while. So, let's continue. Junpei's companions nodded. He nodded back, then slowly and quietly opened the door. Inside was exactly what he expected to see from the map of the ship's interior. They were in a tremendous hall, almost like a ballroom, with a massive central staircase.
Great. Back at the beginning. You sure this is a good idea?
What do you mean?
Well, we already searched every inch of this room, didn't we? I'm asking if there's any reason we came back here.
Of course there's a reason.
Of course there's a reason. Man, sometimes I can't tell if you're smart or just lucky.
Huh?
This.
Junpei pulled two things out of his pockets. The Saturn key card. And the Earth key. Santa cocked his head to one side like an inquisitive bird and looked at them. After several long moments during which it became apparent that Santa had no idea what the cards meant, June took pity on him.
Don't you remember, Santa? On C deck, where we are now, there was a big elevator behind the stairs, remember? And next to the elevator, there was a card reader with a Saturn symbol on it. And on A deck, on the door to the left, there was a keyhole with the Earth symbol on it, I think. So the two keys that Junpei has...
should let us use the elevator and the door on A deck. Huh.
Yes, that's right.
June smiled, pleased with herself. So did Santa.
Alright, I got it. Let's get started then. What do you say we split into two teams? Lotus and I will search the Earth one so you two can search Saturn, alright?
Sounds good.
Junpei handed the Earth key to Santa. They decided that their initial search should be brief, only 10 minutes. They'd meet back near the staircase once they were done. Junpei and June headed for the elevators. Sure enough, there was a card reader bolted to the wall next to the left elevator. He lined up the Saturn keycard and swiped it through the reader. A light on the upper left corner blinked to life.
Great. Looks like it's working now.
Alright. Now, how do I call the elevator?
There was a single button to the right of the elevator door. On the button was the upside-down triangle, the universal symbol for down. There didn't appear to be an up button. Junpei pushed it. He didn't have much of a choice.
It opened! Look, Junpei!
June's voice was excited, but Junpei could hear a tinge of anxiety.
Sweet, it opened. Let's get going.
He grinned at June and stepped toward the open door. As he was about to step foot in it, he felt a hand on his arm.
Wait.
What?
I'm not really... I just... Oh gosh.
Junpei was at something of a loss. What could she possibly be so frightened of? June was probably afraid of... Okay, if we click this, then we skip the entirely hilarious conversation, so I'm obliged to pick this one. After a little thought, Junpei decided that she had to be nervous about being locked up in such a small space alone with a boy. In a way, it was kind of cute. Very demure, you could say, he thought. Still, even though it wasn't exactly roomy in the elevator, they weren't going to be pressed up against one another. At least they didn't have to be. Still, it was making her nervous. Junpei couldn't help but think how innocent she was.
Come on, let's go.
Again, he stepped toward the elevator. And again, he felt himself restrained.
I said wait a minute!
Why?
Aren't you afraid, Junpei?
Afraid of what?
Well, I've never... you know...
She'd never been in an elevator with a man alone before? Even so, she still seemed awfully alarmed.
I might get wet.
What?
Down there. I get soaking wet.
Well, I mean, of course you would. That's the way it works. I mean, I've never heard of anyone getting soaking wet somewhere else.
That's true. You don't mind?
Mind what?
Getting wet.
Well, I don't know. I think I'd probably, like it.
Gosh, Junpei, you're so brave.
Really? I mean, I kind of think any guy would do the same thing, What happens, happens, right? If you get the chance, you've just gotta go for it. That's what a man's supposed to do, I guess.
You're so cool, Junpei. I really admire you.
That doesn't really seem like the sort of thing you ought to admire someone for.
I'm really scared.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you've never done it before.
Yes. So I don't think I'll be able to last very long, and then it'll be over.
Oh, over?
Yes. I'll go to heaven.
Heaven?
It feels kind of like you're floating in space, and your mind gets all fuzzy, like when you pass out. At least, that's what I've heard from people who have experienced it.
Ah, yes. I've heard that too. Although, I don't think the same thing happens to guys.
What?
Huh?
But it would happen to men too, wouldn't it? It would happen to anyone. Once it gets into your body, the same thing happens to everyone.
Well, I mean, usually doesn't go inside the man. I mean, generally.
Yes, it does. Well, eventually it will. It's not like you really have a choice. Your body will force you to swallow some of it, eventually.
What are you trying to do to me?
Nothing. I'm not going to do anything to you. I'm just saying that that's what happens. It's a psychological reaction to what you're experiencing.
Was that really how it happened? It occurred to Junpei that perhaps that was how it worked. Perhaps he'd been mistaken all these years. Had he misunderstood life so gravely? The thought terrified him. June seemed to be entirely oblivious to Junpei's mounting confusion and
I
terror.
know most men probably have larger lungs, but even then, I don't think you could hold your breath for 20 or even 10 minutes. Eventually you'd have to breathe, and then the water would get into your lungs. Once that happens, your body won't be able to get oxygen anymore, and you'll start to feel that floaty feeling as you pass out.
Finally, Junpei understood. He understood what June was trying to say and why she was so scared.
Yeah, you're right. You wouldn't last very long.
See?
She was afraid that the only elevator button pointed down. That meant, of course, that the elevator couldn't go any higher than the floor they were on. As he thought about it, Junpei realized he hadn't seen elevators on the A or B decks near the central staircase. All of which meant that the elevator could only convey to them the lower decks. And the floor below the one they were on, D deck, should be completely submerged. That meant...
Hey, wait a minute. This elevator came up from somewhere under us, right?
Well, yes, I guess it did. It didn't open right away after you pressed the button. There was a motor noise, like it was moving, and then it opened.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes?
So take a look inside.
Junpei jerked his head towards the interior of the elevator.
It's not wet at all, is it? The walls, even the floor, are totally dry.
Oh, you're right, they are.
She looked around the elevator, slightly embarrassed.
Well, let's test it.
Test it?
Yeah, watch this.
Junpei put one foot in the elevator and bent around the corner of the door until he could see the floor buttons. There were only two, E and C. He pushed the E button and jumped out of the elevator. The door slid shut and they heard the grinding of the motor as the elevator car moved down. A few moments later, they heard the sound of the elevator door grinding open several floors below. Junpei nodded to June and pressed the elevator button again. A few moments later, the elevator returned. The door slid open, and just as Junpei had expected, there was no water to be found.
See?
Junpei couldn't resist puffing out his chest just a little bit. June, however, still looked confused.
What does that mean? How can the E deck be safe if the D deck is full of water?
Well, here's what I think. The elevator shaft and E deck must be watertight and separated from wherever the ship's been punctured. Here, let me show you.
He pulled out his notebook and pen and sketched out a rough illustration.
I see. So is that why the ship hasn't sunk? The shape of the inside keeps it from all filling with water?
Yeah, I think that's what's going on.
Junpei continued talking as he closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket.
So I'm gonna go down and check it out. You stay here, alright?
But...
Come on, just do it, alright?
He gave June's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, then hopped onto the elevator. He pushed the E button, and as the door began to close, June looked worried, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was trying to make a decision, when suddenly...
I'm coming with you!
Huh?
At the last possible moment, June dashed forward, turning sideways, just in time to slip through the gap between the closing doors. Junpei jammed his finger against the open button, but it was too late. The door had shut, he and June were in the elevator, and it was headed down to E deck. He was surprised by June that he didn't even have time to think about what awaited him on the E deck. The elevator stopped and the door slid open. They stepped off onto the floor outside the elevator. Nothing seemed especially unusual. No fish going about their fishy business or a jellyfish floating lazily through the water. There was, however, a blowfish. Or at least something that looked very much like one. June's cheeks were puffed out and her mouth a tiny, intense frown.
Oh, knock it off. It's just like I thought. This part hasn't flooded. Come on, just look around. There's no water here.
June looked around nervously, then exhaled.
You're right. It's not flooded at all.
See?
But there's a whole lot of water.
Yeah, right on top of us.
What's going to happen if the ceiling breaks?
Junpei thought about that for a moment.
Well, we'd probably get really wet. Up there.
Huh?
At any rate, we should probably go back as soon as we can, once we're done looking around down here. Lotus and Santa might already be back.
Okay. Good idea.
Junpei glanced around the room they'd found themselves in. The first thing he noticed was a set of thick iron bars. They ran the length of the room, separating the left elevator from the right one.
Well, we can't go over there.
Right.
Then, perhaps, in the corner of the room that housed the elevators, Junpei found an opening. He walked up to it and stuck his head around the corner. A long, straight hallway stretched out in front of him.
That door at the end of the hallway. There's something written on it.
Yeah, let's go have a look.
Junpei and June set off down the hallway at a brisk clip, somewhere between a run and a jog. Before long, they found themselves in front of the door. On it was a number written in bright red paint. 6.
I knew it.
This is a numbered door.
And indeed, there was a red bolted to the wall right next to the door. Of course, with only 2 people, there wasn't much they could do with it.
Alright, let's head back.
Yes.
Junpei and June turned and headed back to C deck. On their way back, Junpei noticed a map on the wall. As it turned out, it was a burnt map of the ship's interior for E deck.
Huh. So you guys found door 1.
They'd met back up with Santa and Lotus, who had explained what they'd found. Apparently, there was another numbered door on A deck, just like the one on E deck, beyond the door that the Earth Key opened. According to Santa and Lotus, there was a 1 on the door. All told, they had discovered 2 new doors, the 6th door and the 1 door.
It is interesting that E deck wasn't flooded.
Lotus was quiet for a moment, lost in thought.
Well, we don't really know if all of E-Deck is safe. We only checked the area around the elevator.
Even so, it's still very interesting.
You said the 6th door was there, right?
Yes.
Then that means Zero planned all this out. Even the sinking. That would have meant some pretty serious remodeling of the ship's interior.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah. I wonder how long it took. I can't even imagine how much it must have cost.
It would have been a ton, that's for sure.
Well, that does go along with what Ace was saying. The most reasonable explanation would be that this was done by some organization with access to a whole lot of cash.
Yes, it does make sense.
That thought made them all go quiet for a moment. June bit her lip while Lotus sighed softly to herself and Santa cracked his stiff neck and stared off into the distance at nothing.
I don't think it's a very good idea to stay here.
June looked up at Junpei with large, pleading eyes.
Yeah, you're right. Ace and his team might be back already.
Well, Junpei and I should be able to open door 1.
Huh? You guys leaving me behind?
8 plus 6 plus 5 equals 19. 1 plus 9 equals 10. 1 plus 0 equals 1.
Just kidding. Alright, let's go.
Lotus's words were all the impetus they needed. Back to the large hospital room they went. The moment they stepped inside, a tremendous voice echoed across the room.
Hey, where the hell did you guys go?
It was 7. Ace was right behind him, and Clover was behind Ace, although she seemed to be hanging back. It looked as though there was something strange about them. 7 had the look of a man who'd seen a ghost. Ace was just as pale, and Clover looked as though she was only moments from passing out entirely. For a long moment, they simply stood there, looking at one another. Junpei looked around nervously, waiting for someone else to speak. No one did. He looked at 7.
What happened?
What the hell kind of question is that?
7 was trying very hard to be angry, but something had shaken him hard. His shoulders were trembling and his voice was strained.
Snake is...
7 couldn't finish. He just looked away, his face twisted by... Junpei wasn't sure what. Instead, Ace spoke. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and spoke.
Snake is dead. He died, just as the 9th man did.
It was as if all the air had suddenly been sucked out of the room. Junpei felt his heartbeat quicken, and he realized he was having trouble breathing. He could feel cold sweat beading on his forehead and neck. June, Santa, and Lotus looked the way he felt. All 3 were frozen in place, their faces white.
Oh my god. That's not true, is it?
We should make sure.
Yeah, right. We should...
They nodded to one another and headed towards the number 3 door.
Wait, not that way.
They stopped short and turned to look at 7. He was pointing at the door with no number.
I stuck a screwdriver in there to keep the door from closing all the way. It's not locked, so you can go in that way.
Where is he?
The shower room, on the left side of the hallway. I put a broom in there too, to keep the door open.
We can get it without going through the numbered door, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Their new destination clear, Junpei and his companions headed for the door with no number. Once in the hallway, it was easy to spot the metal door on the left wall. It hadn't been open when they'd been through before, But now, just as Seven had said, there was a broom stuck in between the door and the frame, keeping it open. They looked at it for a moment, then stepped inside.
Ugh. It smells horrible.
Lotus wrinkled her nose and covered her mouth in disgust. Even Santa pinched his nose shut.
Yeah, this is pretty awful. Feel like I'm gonna puke.
It was just as bad as they said, perhaps worse. A hideous smell filled the air, so thick they could almost taste it. It was sour and smelled of fish, feces, and burnt meat. It worked its way through Junpei's nose and down his throat to pound against the entrance to his stomach. He put his hands over his mouth and struggled to keep what little was in his stomach where it belonged. They didn't have to wonder where the body was. There was blood everywhere, a few arms of the splatter reaching toward them as they walked in through the door. All one had to do was follow the many radial arms to their source. The body itself was hidden behind a divider.
June, you should stay here.
But
Please, just do me a favor, okay? Alright?
He didn't give her a chance to say no. He put his hand on her shoulder as if to shove her into the ground like a tent pole, turned and walked toward the end of the divider. It felt like it took an eternity for him to get there. Santa and Lotus followed, timid and nervous as a pair of children. Eventually they reached the divider. They looked at one another and nodded, slowly. Junpei put his hands on the divider and peered around the corner. For a moment he forgot to breathe. He felt his heart collapse in his chest like an empty cigarette carton, and time froze. He knew that in an instant that he would take the image before him to the grave. What was left of the body sat in a sea of blood. Chunks of flesh torn from the body sat in the blood like tiny islands in a great red sea. A vast, ragged hole had been torn in the torso, and what remained of his intestines spilled out of it like fresh spaghetti. Smaller chunks of meat had splattered against the wall and became stuck there as they dried. Globules of yellowish fat had left trails like tiny slugs as gravity pulled them down the wall, even as they dried to it.
Just like Ace said.
Santa's voice was strained. Junpei suspected he was holding down some vomit of his own.
Just like the ninth man. The detonator in his bracelet said the bomb in his gut.
It looked as though the explosion had been quite powerful. His legs were both bent in an odd, unnatural way, and his left arm had split open, exposing the painfully white bone of his ulna. His bracelet lay next to him. It seemed to have hit the wall hard enough to have shattered the display, which lay on the ground in pieces. Half of his head had simply collapsed. The blood coating almost made it look like raw pizza dough covered in tomato sauce. His clothes, too, were covered in blood. The burgundy tie, the white shirt, the jacket with all the yellow piping, and the gray slacks. They were all familiar to Junpei.
No mistake about that. It's Snake.
Lotus's voice was unnaturally deep and strained, and Junpei heard it catch in her throat. The squeal of tortured metal made Junpei's teeth curl. It sounded like the noise a ghost would make. No matter how many times he heard it, he never got used to it. Every time it put him on edge. It didn't help that there was a girl nearby who looked far more like a ghost than a living human should. It was Clover. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head drooping listlessly onto her chest. Her eyes were blank and stared across the room at nothing. Her breathing was slow and mechanical. Aside from the rise and fall of her chest, she didn't move. Junpei felt as if a nudge might cause her to shatter into 1,000 pieces.
Snake was probably murdered. Chances are, he was killed the same way the ninth man was.
Seven lowered his voice, likely in an effort to keep Clover from hearing what he had to say. There were 4 other people in the room with Junpei and Seven. Ace, Santa, June, and Lotus. Seven looked at each one of them in turn and continued.
It's pretty straightforward. Not that hard to figure out how they did it. First, the killers got Snake to authenticate on the red to open door 3. Then they shoved him into it, alone, and waited 9 seconds for the door to shut. Once the door shut, it was over for Snake, but he didn't give up. Probably knew it wouldn't do him any good, but he probably ran into the shower room, looking for the dead. It was a small chance, but it wasn't like he had anything to lose. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The detonator's only deactivated if everybody who authenticated when they went and uses the dead. And then 8 seconds after he was shoved in, that happened.
I see. So that's what you meant by killers, huh? You need at least 3 people to open one of the numbered doors, including Snake. It wouldn't open for Snake and a single killer.
Exactly. That means we're looking at multiple perps here.
Junpei crossed his arms and grunted.
Well, just in case, I want to make sure. Let's say you're right. When do you think Snake was killed?
When we all split up to look for parts for the Reds, I think. Right after that was when we noticed he was gone.
Then that means none of us have alibis. We were all off searching the rooms we've been assigned, looking for those parts.
Yeah. That means anybody could be a killer.
Wait a minute. What are you talking about?
June seemed shocked.
How can you say one of us is a killer so casually?
Well, not just one of us. If I'm right, then at least 2 of us are murderers.
Why don't you calm down a bit, Seven? What are you going to gain by being so suspicious? That's what Zero wants, you know.
What? Zero wants.
Exactly. This game was set up by Zero, wasn't it? Any game has a winner and a loser. Whoever makes it to door 9 is a winner, and those who don't are the losers. Zero is trying to make us fight against one another for that victory.
Then you're saying that Zero is trying to split us up by making us fight each other.
Yes. That is why we can't let ourselves fall prey to suspicion. We have to trust one another and form a strong bond of friendship. Otherwise, we'll end up being ensnared by Zero's manipulations.
Then, does that mean that the person who killed Snake?
Yes, almost certainly Zero himself. If there's anyone we should doubt, it should be Zero. He masterminded this game and kidnapped all of us. Doesn't it seem reasonable that he would have killed Snake as well?
Junpei hadn't really considered that. If Zero had killed Snake, then Zero was on the ship with him. Was Zero still on the ship with him? Of course. Of course he was. That was obvious. Zero was somewhere on the ship, but Junpei had no idea where. Junpei mumbled to himself, lost in thought.
Where could Zero be hiding?
We might possibly find out next episode. Rate, comment, subscribe, favorite, and see you guys next time.